Jumping over to PS5 Pro, we retain all the base PS5 quality mode enhancements in object LODs, the improved shadow LODs, and the upgraded GI. Curiously, switching between Pro and base PS5's quality mode, there's a further difference to the GI setting on the newer mid-gen refresh console. Ambient occlusion, shading, beneath plants on PS5 Pro is often thicker. In other words, all of the quality mode upgrades are here combined with the performance mode's 60fps target, making it, in theory, a best of both worlds solution. Perhaps the more radical change though is that PS5 Pro switches to Sony's PSSR upscaler, where, based on the PlayStation blog last year, the promise is that PSSR helps Pro to a smoother frame rate overall. Konami adjusts the native resolution as well, now putting PS5 Pro at a dynamic 756p to 1152p. So on paper, that's at least an upgrade on base PS5's performance mode, while falling short of the quality mode in raw pixels pushed. Still, you'd hope the PSSR factor, the hardware-accelerated AI upscaling, might help to bridge the gap in clarity. To an extent, it is a benefit, but sadly, PSSR also introduces its own issues in the process. On the positive side first, in motion, PS5 Pro has an advantage next to both modes on base PS5. Note Snake's beard and hair in this looping shot, where PSSR more adeptly cleans up the coarse, flickering artifacts as he turns. Likewise, and notably when compared to the 60fps performance mode, PS5 Pro's method is better at dealing with occlusion artifacts, as an object obscures geometry for a few frames. Repeating the test over and over, the result is less flickering on busy mesh patterns, creating a more stable image with PSSR. On to the downsides next for PS5 Pro. Point number one is that often you'll notice that PSSR appears to resolve details to a lower resolution overall. Zooming in by 4 times on a still moment, distant details like grass resolve to a crisper result via base PS5 scaling method, surprisingly, even on the performance mode. Partly this is the upscaling method, but there's also the raw resolution metrics to consider, which are on average lower on PS5 Pro before the upscale even begins. So I put this to the test. For example, this early shot overlooking the jungle ahead puts base PS5's performance mode at 864p in this exact frame, the quality mode at 1412p, and then PS5 Pro trails behind at 756p in this moment. In other words, PS5 Pro has less pixel data to work with it often running at the lowest 756p value of its DRS range. So it's a win in motion for PS5 Pro, with a smarter handling of occlusion artifacts and swaying grass, but if left to settle, the resolved, reconstructed image on PS5 Pro seems to struggle to match the clarity of base PS5. The final point is perhaps the most frustrating, that PSSR doesn't always properly denoise the image. We've seen this before in the likes of Silent Hill 2 Remake at the PS5 Pro's launch. The result in MGS Delta's case is that there's an increase in shimmer all round on global illumination around interiors, with shading on walls flickering more so than base PS5. To be clear, both PS5 machines have an obvious issue with GI flickering around the lab complex a few hours in. This is without doubt a weak point for Delta's delivery on PS5 and does need addressing. But PSSR appears to accentuate the problem, adding more flicker, more temporal instability to areas where there's no issue on base PS5. It's even noticeable across the shaded patches under grass on PS5 Pro, resulting in more shimmering while outdoors. Overall, the Pro enhancement here is hard to celebrate when there are as many drawbacks as benefits, and worse still, Pro users are stripped of the option to use any other mode or scaler. MGS Delta's performance is also a disappointment. The performance mode on base PS5 targets 60fps, and the outlook is reasonable to start at least. Snake's initial landing area on the Virtuous mission, the Crocodile Swamp, and a late bridge section all run at between 48 to 60fps, with frame rates more often resting at the upper end of that range. In other words, it's ideal VRR material for those with display supporting that technology, And with VRR active, you should get a perceptually smooth experience. This all changes, however, once you hit Razvet, the early compound filled with Ocelot's guards. The high enemy count here, plus those explosive barrels, all conspire to tank that frame rate during combat, and we're more realistically operating at between 30 to 50 FPS. I've taken the more run and gun approach in this case, but even sticking to stealth, this does sadly fall outside the VRR window on PS5. The other performance hotspot, it seems, relates to swimming underwater. Later swamp areas and a boss battle with the Pain all run reasonably well at 50 to 60 FPS up until you dive beneath the water surface, in which case the reading tanks to 40 FPS and even just under. MGS Delta on base PS5 has a serious range in performance then, and there are action-heavy segments where you'll spend more time under 60 FPS than at the mark. As an aside, John and Rich have seen the Xbox Series X build at Gamescom, and while we can only provide limited impressions going by eye, it does seem Series X has similar performance issues to PS5 in targeting 60. Base PS5's 30 FPS quality mode is up next, and there's an issue here too. Firstly, and obviously, the 30 FPS cap here runs with uneven frame pacing, which adds judder to motion. The game's motion blur setting helps to an extent, but it's simply not ideal. Compounding this issue is the fact that there are genuine drops beneath 30 FPS at stress points, like the sight of exploding barrels or diving underwater. So, despite the improved visual settings on base PS5's quality mode and running at a clearly higher resolution on average, the trade-off in playability makes it hard to recommend. Of course, this 30 FPS cap is impossible to avoid on base PS5 in cutscenes, as both modes run all scripted scenes at 30 FPS with that uneven cadence of frames. Moving on to PS5 Pro, matters are made simpler, of course, by having only one means of playing the game at 60 FPS. Cutscenes, in this case, run entirely uncapped to 60 FPS, which on the plus side means no uneven frame pacing at 30, but on the downside, they're often way off the mark with a range of 40 to 60 FPS. The other surprise is that PS5 Pro's frame rate in actual gameplay is on average lower than base PS5's performance mode. The initial landing area immediately shows dips under 60, for example, whereas there are none on base PS5, and the divide only widens from that point. As we progress to the swamp and then later the bridge, it's more of a challenge for VRR to engage properly with fewer frames, and certainly so once we get to combat in Razvet at 30 to 60 FPS. For perspective, in comparing the two PS5 machines directly with a matched route, the base model is enjoying up to a plus 7 FPS advantage over Pro hardware. Every segment of the jungle, it seems, takes preference to the lower LOD and GI settings of base PS5's performance mode, plus its lower DRS range, and of course the absence of PSSR as an upscaler. Really, it's hard to see an upside here when, again, PS5 Pro users are stripped of a graphics mode toggle, leaving no backup option behind. It's also tempting to imagine how the base PS5 setup, with its lower settings, might have run on Pro hardware if left exactly as is, and if we'd have actually locked closer to 60 FPS in that case. On the plus side, some areas do run better on Pro overall later on. The lab area, for example, a few hours into the game does hold closer to 60 on PS5 Pro, while base PS5 falls shy with a 50 FPS reading. For interior sections then, Pro might have an advantage, but certainly for outdoor jungles, the results are a clear, unexpected downgrade.